I still remember the exact words my mother whispered before the judge entered the courtroom. "You'll leave here with nothing, Emily." She smiled as if the ending had already been written, and my father chuckled loud enough for everyone seated behind us to hear. Their confidence echoed through the polished courtroom, drawing amused glances from strangers who had no idea they were witnessing the last few minutes before my parents lost everything they had spent years trying to take from me. I didn't answer. I simply folded my hands in my lap and looked toward the empty bench where the judge would appear any second. If someone had walked into that courtroom without knowing our story, they would have assumed I was the one about to lose. My parents looked relaxed. Their expensive clothes, confident smiles, and casual conversations with their attorney made them appear untouchable. They laughed as though this hearing were a family inconvenience instead of the final chapter of a years-long legal battle. I must have looked very different. My attorney once told me I had the calmest face he'd ever seen before a verdict. He mistook it for confidence. It wasn't confidence. It was exhaustion. There comes a point when you've cried so many tears that your heart simply stops asking life to be fair. I had crossed that point a long time ago. The courtroom smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper. Soft conversations drifted through the room before fading into silence as the bailiff stepped forward. "All rise." Everyone stood. The judge entered without expression, carrying a thick folder that represented nearly 4 years of investigations, financial records, witness testimony, property documents, and evidence collected one careful piece at a time. My father leaned toward my mother. "This is finally over," he muttered. She nodded without looking at me. "It should have been over years ago." I almost smiled. They were right. It should have ended years earlier. It should have ended the day I realized my parents no longer saw me as their daughter. Instead, they saw an opportunity. The judge settled into his chair and adjusted his glasses while reviewing the documents one last time. Every page that turned seemed painfully loud inside the silent courtroom. Across the aisle, my mother's fingers rested casually on her designer handbag. My father tapped his expensive watch against the armrest with impatient confidence. Neither of them appeared nervous. Why would they? For months, they had convinced themselves the law would reward them. They believed blood mattered more than contracts. Promises mattered more than signatures. Family mattered more than facts. They had underestimated one thing. Facts never cared about feelings. I slowly inhaled, forcing myself to remain perfectly still. The temptation to look at them was overwhelming. Not because I hated them, because I remembered them. I remembered birthday parties where my father lifted me onto his shoulders. I remembered my mother reading bedtime stories when thunderstorms frightened me. Those memories had once been enough to convince me that family could survive anything. Now they simply reminded me that people could become strangers long before they stopped sharing the same last name. My attorney quietly slid a yellow legal pad toward me. "You all right?" he whispered. I nodded once. "I've never been more ready." He offered a reassuring smile before turning his attention back toward the bench. Outside the tall courtroom windows, sunlight reflected against neighboring buildings, filling the room with a soft golden glow that felt strangely peaceful. I wondered if peace always arrived this quietly. No dramatic music, no shouting, no sudden revelation, just silence before the truth finally spoke for itself. The judge closed the folder. Every sound disappeared. Even my father's confident tapping stopped. He cleared his throat and looked across the courtroom. His eyes paused briefly on my parents. Then they settled on me. "For the record," he began calmly, "this court has carefully reviewed every document, every financial transaction, every witness statement, and every piece of evidence submitted throughout these proceedings." My mother's smile remained. My father's confidence never wavered. Neither of them realized that the sentence about to leave the judge's lips would erase everything they believed they had already won. The judge's voice faded into the background as my mind drifted somewhere it hadn't visited in years, to a small white house with a porch swing where I once believed I had the happiest family in the world. No one is born expecting to sue their own parents. If someone had told 12-year-old Emily Carter that one day she would sit across a courtroom from the two people she loved most, I would have laughed. Back then, my father was my hero. He taught me how to ride a bicycle, how to plant tomatoes in our backyard, and how to shake someone's hand with confidence. Whenever I scraped my knee, he carried me inside as though I were the most precious thing in the world. My mother kissed every bruise and reminded me that family always stood together. I believed every word. Looking back now, I don't think they were lying. I think life simply revealed who they truly were when money entered the conversation. Everything changed after I graduated from college. Unlike most of my friends, I didn't move across the country chasing a dream. I stayed close to home because my parents insisted they needed me. My father had begun slowing down, and my mother constantly reminded me how difficult it was to manage the family property alone. "You've always been the responsible one," she would say. Those words sounded like praise. I didn't realize they were becoming chains. Whenever something broke, I paid for it. Whenever property taxes came due, I covered them. If the roof leaked, I hired contractors. If the plumbing failed, I wrote another check. My parents always promised they'd repay me once things improved. Things never improved. Instead, the requests grew larger. "Just until next month. Just this once. We're family." Those three phrases quietly emptied my savings account over the years. I never kept track. Love doesn't keep receipts. At least, I didn't think it should. My father often introduced me to neighbors with pride. "This is our daughter. She's successful." I smiled every time he said it. Only later did I realize success meant something different to him. To me, success meant independence. To him, it meant I had resources he could use. The first time I questioned one of their financial decisions, my mother's expression changed in a way I'd never seen before. "After everything we've done for you," she said softly. The guilt worked immediately. I apologized. Imagine apologizing for asking where your own money had gone. That's who I was back then. Every birthday check from relatives somehow ended up helping with another family emergency. Every promotion at work became another excuse for someone to ask for more. When I received my largest bonus after years of working as a project manager for a commercial architecture firm, my parents surprised me with dinner. I thought they wanted to celebrate. Instead, they handed me a folder. Inside were estimates for repairs on one of the rental properties they owned. "You can help us get ahead," my father said with a smile. I looked at the numbers. The repairs cost almost exactly what my bonus had been. "You'll earn it back," my mother assured me. Family helps family. I wrote the check before dessert arrived. Not because they forced me, because I still believed that one day everything would balance itself. That one day my parents would look at me with gratitude instead of expectation. Years passed. The pattern never changed. If I bought myself something nice, someone suddenly had an emergency. If I planned a vacation, another financial crisis appeared. Every dream I postponed somehow became another investment in our family's future. Only later would I discover there had never been a future waiting for me inside their plans. There was only another request, another promise, another reason why Emily would understand. The strange part wasn't how often they asked. It was how naturally I said yes. By the time I finally learned the truth, I had spent more than a decade believing sacrifice was another word for love. I didn't yet understand that real love protects. It doesn't keep taking until there's nothing left. People often ask when betrayal begins. Most imagine a single moment, a shocking confession, a forged signature, or a slammed door. That wasn't true for me. Betrayal arrived so quietly that I mistook it for love. The first crack appeared when I turned 32. After years of saving every extra dollar, I finally bought a small craftsman-style house on the edge of town. It wasn't extravagant. The kitchen needed updating, the porch leaned slightly to one side, and the backyard was more weeds than grass. But every mortgage payment came from my paycheck. Every improvement came from my weekends. Every room slowly became a reflection of the life I had worked so hard to build. When my parents visited for the first time, my father walked through each room with his hands folded behind his back like he was inspecting a property he intended to purchase. "It's bigger than I expected," he said. My mother smiled politely. "It would be perfect for family holidays." I laughed. "I guess you'll both have to visit more often." At the time, I thought we were talking about Thanksgiving dinners. I didn't realize they were already imagining something else. A few months later, my parents called one Sunday evening. Their voices sounded unusually serious. "We need to talk," my father said. I drove to their house immediately. He explained that one of their rental properties had become uninhabitable after severe storm damage. Insurance was taking longer than expected, and several repairs would cost far more than they could afford. "It'll only be temporary," my mother assured me. "We just need somewhere to stay for a few weeks." There wasn't a second of hesitation. Of course, looking back now, I wonder if kindness always carries the risk of being mistaken for permission. They moved into my guest bedroom the following weekend. At first, Everything felt normal. My mother cooked dinner. My father mowed the lawn even though I told him he didn't have to. We watched old movies together in the evenings. For a little while, it almost felt like having a family again. Then small things began changing. Without asking, my mother redecorated the living room. She replaced my curtains because they looked too modern. Family photographs I'd carefully chosen disappeared from shelves, replaced with older pictures from my childhood. One afternoon, I came home to find my father giving a tour of my house to two of his longtime friends. "This is our place," he proudly told them. "Our place." The words caught my attention immediately. I assumed he had simply misspoken. I let it go. The next week, my bedroom door, the only room my parents never entered, was unlocked when I returned from work. Nothing appeared to be missing. Still, I knew I had locked it before leaving that morning. When I asked my mother about it, she frowned. "We were just cleaning." "You don't need permission to clean your own daughter's house." Something inside me wanted to argue. Instead, I apologized for sounding ungrateful. Again, the weeks stretched into months. Insurance delays became contractor delays. Contractor delays became financial delays. Every explanation sounded reasonable on its own. Together, they formed a story that never actually moved forward. Neighbors slowly began assuming my parents owned the property. Packages addressed to Robert Carter started arriving at my front door. Utility bills somehow listed both of my parents' names as additional contacts. Even the mail carrier began greeting my father as if he'd lived there for years. When I mentioned how strange it all seemed, my father laughed. "You worry too much. We're family." The same 3 words. Always enough to silence me. Until one Saturday afternoon. I had left work early after developing a migraine. As I pulled into the driveway, 3 unfamiliar SUVs were parked across my lawn. Music echoed from inside the house. Children were running through my flower beds. The front door stood wide open. When I stepped inside, nearly 30 people filled my living room. Cousins, aunts, uncles, neighbors I'd never met. My dining table had been moved onto the patio. Someone had rearranged my furniture to make room for a buffet. My mother looked up from the kitchen and smiled as though nothing about the scene required an explanation. "Oh good," she said cheerfully. "You're home." Then she handed me a tray of drinks. "Would you mind serving everyone?" she asked. "There are guests." "Not your guests. Our guests." Standing in the middle of my own home, surrounded by strangers who believed they had every right to be there, I felt something inside me shift for the very first time. Not anger. Not yet. Just the quiet realization that somewhere along the way, my parents had stopped treating my house as a favor. They had started treating it as if it already belonged to them. There is a moment in every person's life when denial becomes more painful than the truth. For me, that moment arrived while I was washing empty glasses after everyone had gone home. The party had ended hours earlier. Half-eaten food covered my kitchen counters. Mud stained the hardwood floors I had refinished with my own hands. Someone had broken one of my grandmother's porcelain serving dishes and quietly thrown the pieces into the trash. No one had mentioned it. No one had apologized. I stood alone in the sink's dim light, staring at the mountain of dirty dishes left behind by people I hadn't invited into my own home. My mother walked into the kitchen carrying a cup of coffee. Without looking at me, she said, "We'll probably host Christmas here this year." Not, "Would that be okay?" Not, "What do you think?" Just a decision that had apparently already been made. I dried my hands on a towel. "Mom, this is my house." She finally looked up. For just a second. Then she smiled. "Don't be so dramatic." That sentence echoed in my mind long after she walked away. Don't be so dramatic. It amazed me how quickly someone could dismiss your feelings when they benefited from ignoring them. Over the next few weeks, I started paying attention instead of making excuses. I noticed my father giving contractors instructions about my property without speaking to me first. I noticed relatives calling my mother to ask permission before visiting my house. I noticed family mail arriving with my address listed beneath my parents' names. Each incident seemed small. Together, they painted a picture I could no longer ignore. One Friday evening, I returned home to find a locksmith's van parked in the driveway. My father was standing beside the front door. "What happened?" I asked. "The front lock was getting old," he answered casually. "So I had it replaced." I froze. "You changed the locks?" He shrugged. "They work better now." I reached into my purse for my key. It no longer fit. For several seconds, I simply stared at it. The key I'd carried every day for years had become completely useless. I don't have a key, I said quietly. Oh, my father reached into his pocket. I forgot to make you one. Forgot. As if locking the homeowner out of her own house were a minor oversight. My mother appeared behind him holding grocery bags. She looked almost annoyed that I had interrupted their afternoon. You can use ours until we make another copy. Ours. Again. Every word they chose revealed more than they realized. I accepted the temporary key without arguing. Not because I agreed. Because something inside me had finally become very, very quiet. That silence frightened me. It wasn't surrender. It was observation. I began noticing details I would have overlooked before. The mailbox now displayed only my father's last name. Several utility accounts had been modified without my knowledge. A neighbor congratulated my parents for finding such a beautiful forever home. Forever. The word lingered in my mind. One evening, while taking out the trash, I overheard voices drifting through the open dining room window. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. I simply stopped walking when I heard my own name. My aunt laughed. So, when are you finally telling Emily? My father answered first. We don't have to. A few people chuckled. My mother spoke next. By the time she realizes what's happening, it'll already be done. What if she fights it? Someone asked. My father laughed louder than anyone. She won't. Emily always folds. The conversation moved on. They started discussing vacation plans. Inside the house, everyone sounded relaxed. Outside, I stood perfectly still beside my garbage bin, unable to feel my hands. Emily always folds. I realized they weren't simply taking advantage of my kindness anymore. They were counting on it, depending on it, building their entire future around the belief that I would never stand up for myself. For years, I had feared losing my family. Standing alone in the darkness that evening, I understood something far more painful. I had already lost them. The only person who hadn't realized it until that moment was me. I quietly walked back to my car instead of entering the house. Then I sat behind the steering wheel, opened my phone, searched for the highest-rated real estate litigation attorney in the county, and scheduled the first available consultation for Monday morning. I didn't tell my parents. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. For the first time in my life, I stopped trying to convince them to love me. Instead, I decided to let the facts speak for themselves. The lawyer's office didn't look the way television had taught me it would. There were no towering shelves filled with dramatic leather-bound books. No frantic assistants rushing through hallways. No intimidating conference room with walls of glass. Instead, there was a quiet office that smelled faintly of coffee and old paper, where every word seemed to matter more than every decoration. Jonathan Hayes greeted me with a firm handshake and an expression that revealed nothing. He looked to be in his early 50s, with silver beginning to creep into his dark hair and the calm demeanor of someone who had spent decades watching people lie under oath. What brings you here, Miss Carter? I opened my mouth. Nothing came out, because saying the truth out loud somehow made it real. I paused. I think my parents are trying to take my house. He didn't react. He simply reached for a yellow legal pad. Tell me everything. For nearly 2 hours, I did. I described the financial support I'd given them over the years. The repairs, the bills, the parties, the new locks, the conversations I'd overheard. Every promise, every excuse, every time I had convinced myself that love required sacrifice. When I finally finished, Jonathan remained silent for several moments. Then he asked the first question no one else had ever asked me. Whose name is on the deed? Mine. Only yours. Yes. The mortgage? Mine. The down payment? I paid every dollar. The renovations? Also mine. He nodded slowly. Good. I blinked. Good. Ms. Carter, he said evenly. People confuse possession with ownership every day. They're not the same thing. His words settled into the room with surprising weight. For someone to believe they're entitled to something doesn't mean they actually are. I felt the first flicker of hope I'd experienced in months. Then he held up one finger. But hope isn't evidence. That sentence changed the direction of my life. Jonathan didn't promise victory. He didn't tell me justice always prevailed. Instead, he gave me a legal checklist. Every canceled check, every mortgage payment, every property tax receipt, every email, every text message, every invoice, every insurance record, every contractor estimate, every bank transfer. People remember conversations differently, he explained. Documents don't. For the next several weeks, my evenings transformed into something resembling an audit. After work, I sat at my dining table surrounded by stacks of folders. I downloaded years of bank statements, requested archived loan documents, printed thousands of emails, photographed every room inside my house, saved security camera footage from the smart doorbell I'd installed years earlier, mostly to protect packages from porch thieves. I smiled bitterly when I realized it had captured something far more valuable. Patterns, people coming and going, deliveries, visitors, dates, timestamps, facts. Meanwhile, life inside the house continued as though nothing had changed. My parents laughed over dinner, planned future renovations, discussed replacing the kitchen cabinets. My kitchen cabinets. One evening, my father unfolded a brochure across the dining table. "What do you think about extending the back patio?" I looked at the drawings. It would increase the property's value. Property, not home, not family. Property. I finally understood why that word mattered. "It's a nice design," I answered calmly. He smiled. "I knew you'd come around." I almost laughed. He believed silence meant agreement. He had no idea silence could also be preparation. Jonathan instructed me never to argue unless absolutely necessary. "Let them keep talking," he advised. "The more confident they become, the less careful they'll be." So I listened. Every careless conversation, every assumption, every decision they made without asking me. I wrote everything down. Dates, times, witnesses, exact wording. For the first time in my life, I stopped being the daughter trying to keep the peace. Instead, I became the quiet observer everyone forgot was watching. Then, one rainy Tuesday afternoon, something happened that neither my attorney nor I had expected. I came home earlier than usual because a client meeting had been canceled. As I walked toward the front door, I noticed two unfamiliar men carrying boxes from my garage into a moving truck. At first, I assumed my parents were donating old furniture. Then I recognized the boxes. They contained my personal files, family photo albums, tax records, my college diplomas, even the locked fireproof safe that held original property documents. I hurried toward them. "What are you doing?" One of the movers looked confused. "We're following the owner's instructions." Owner. The word struck harder than any insult ever had. Before I could say another word, my father stepped out onto the porch holding a clipboard. His expression wasn't apologetic. It was irritated. "Emily," he said, as though I were interrupting his afternoon. "You should have called before coming home." At that exact moment, I realized this wasn't just a misunderstanding anymore. My parents weren't slowly pretending my house belonged to them. They had already begun acting as if I no longer belonged there at all. The strange thing about deciding to fight back is that nothing changes on the outside. At least, not at first. The morning after I found movers carrying my belongings out of the garage, I woke up at 6, made coffee, went to work, attended meetings, answered emails, and smiled at clients. If anyone had asked how I was doing, I would have said, "I'm fine." It wasn't a lie. For the first time in months, I actually was. Not because the situation had improved, because I had stopped expecting my parents to become different people. That acceptance changed everything. When I arrived home that evening, my mother was sitting at the kitchen island flipping through a magazine. She barely looked up. "We're thinking about repainting the downstairs," she said. "What color?" I asked. She blinked, surprised I hadn't argued. "I was thinking ivory. Ivory would look nice." She smiled with obvious relief. "I knew you'd understand." I almost felt sorry for her. She mistook my calmness for surrender. Jonathan had warned me this would happen. "The moment difficult people stop getting resistance," he had said, "they become careless." He was right. Within days, my parents became bolder than ever. My father hired landscapers without mentioning it to me. My mother scheduled furniture deliveries. Relatives began referring to my house as Robert and Linda's place, without anyone correcting them. I said nothing. Instead, I documented everything. Every invoice left on the counter, every contractor's business card, every delivery receipt, every conversation captured by my legally installed security cameras at the front entrance. The cameras had originally been installed to record motion around the property. Now they quietly recorded something far more valuable. Who gave instructions? Who claimed ownership? Who introduced themselves as the homeowners? The evidence accumulated one ordinary day at a time. Jonathan reviewed each new file during our weekly meetings. He rarely showed emotion. Until one Thursday afternoon. He watched a video from my front porch. A delivery driver asked, "Where would you like these cabinets installed, sir?" My father answered without hesitation, "I'm the owner. Put everything inside." Jonathan paused the recording. "Did you hear that?" "I've heard him say it before." "No," he replied. "I mean legally." He leaned back in his chair. People often reveal their intentions when they believe no one is paying attention. He printed a transcript of the conversation and placed it into a growing folder. Evidence. That folder seemed almost ordinary. Plain brown cardboard. No dramatic labels. No bright stickers. Yet inside it rested the truth my parents believed they had hidden. A week later, another unexpected opportunity appeared. I received an email from the county recorder's office confirming that someone had recently requested copies of my property's recorded documents. I hadn't requested them. Neither had Jonathan. He immediately advised me to obtain the request log. The record showed exactly who had made the request. Robert Carter. My father. It wasn't illegal. Anyone could request public property records. But the timing mattered, especially when paired with everything else. Jonathan smiled for the first time since taking my case. "They're building towards something." "What do you mean?" "They're not behaving like temporary guests anymore." He tapped the folder. "They're preparing for permanence." That sentence stayed with me all weekend. Permanent. I wondered how long they had been planning this. Months? Years? Had every request for help been another step toward this moment? Had they ever intended to leave? The answer arrived sooner than I expected. Monday evening, I pulled into the driveway behind my father's truck. As I walked toward the front porch, I noticed several envelopes spread across the dining room table through the front window. One immediately caught my attention. It displayed the logo of a law office. My father and mother were sitting together, reading its contents. Neither of them noticed me standing outside. Then my father laughed. "I told you she'd never challenge us." My mother smiled. "She's too soft." He folded the papers neatly. "Once these are filed, she'll have no choice but to accept reality." I quietly unlocked the front door. The conversation stopped instantly. My father slipped the envelope beneath a stack of newspapers. Too late. I had already seen the attorney's letterhead. I greeted them exactly as I always did. "How was your day?" "Busy," my father answered. "What about yours?" "The usual." We ate dinner together that night. My mother talked about recipes. My father complained about gasoline prices. No one mentioned the envelope. No one mentioned attorneys. No one mentioned ownership. But after they went to bed, I walked into the kitchen, opened my laptop, and sent Jonathan a single sentence. "I think they're about to make their move." His reply arrived less than 2 minutes later. "So are we." The most dangerous mistake people make is believing that the first move wins the game. It doesn't. The player who understands the board usually does. 3 days after I sent Jonathan the message about the attorney's letter, he called me before sunrise. "They filed." I sat upright in bed. What exactly did they file? A petition claiming they have an equitable ownership interest in the property. I closed my eyes. For a moment, the words sounded almost absurd. My parents. The people who hadn't paid a single mortgage payment, who weren't listed anywhere on the deed, who had lived in my house as guests, were now asking a court to recognize them as rightful owners. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now," Jonathan replied calmly, "they start proving their story, and we start proving the truth." His confidence wasn't loud. It wasn't theatrical. It came from preparation. By lunchtime, I was sitting across from him in his office as he spread documents across a conference table. My mortgage statements, closing documents, wire transfer confirmations, insurance policies, property tax receipts. Every record stretched back years. They'll probably argue they invested money, improved the property, or relied on promises you supposedly made. I never made those promises. I know. He tapped another folder. But courts don't decide cases based on feelings. They decide them based on evidence. Then he opened the thick brown folder we had spent weeks building. Inside were printed photographs from my security cameras, email chains, bank records, delivery invoices, contractor receipts, even transcripts of conversations captured by the front door camera. For the first time, I saw everything together, not as scattered incidents, as a timeline. Every event connected perfectly to the next. Every assumption my parents had made was documented. Every step they had taken believing no one was watching had quietly become another piece of evidence. Jonathan smiled faintly. "They think they've been writing their own success story. They've actually been writing ours." That afternoon, I drove home carrying nothing except an empty briefcase. The important documents remained locked inside Jonathan's office. I wanted the house to look exactly the same. Normal, predictable, unthreatening. My parents were in the backyard discussing patio furniture with two neighbors. When my father noticed me, he waved casually. "Good news," he called. "We've almost finished planning everything." Planning everything. I smiled politely. "I'm glad." He seemed pleased by my reaction. He expected anger. Instead, he received agreement. It made him careless. Later that evening, while clearing dinner plates, my mother glanced at me. "You've been awfully quiet lately." "I've just been busy." She nodded. "I was worried you might still be upset." I looked directly at her. "I'm not upset anymore." That wasn't entirely true. I had simply moved beyond anger. Anger makes people unpredictable. Discipline makes them dangerous. The following week became a performance. Every day, my parents behaved as though victory were inevitable. My father invited relatives over to celebrate what he called our new beginning. My mother measured rooms for custom curtains. They laughed more, talked louder, dreamed bigger. Several family members congratulated them before any judge had heard a single word. Apparently, my parents had already told everyone that I had accepted reality. I let them believe it. Jonathan called this controlled silence. The more certain they become, he reminded me, the more they'll commit themselves to one version of events. They can't change that story later. Then came the moment neither of us had anticipated. One Saturday afternoon, my cousin Rachel quietly knocked on my bedroom door. She looked nervous. "Can we talk?" We stepped onto the back porch. She lowered her voice immediately. "I don't think you know what's happening. I probably know more than you think." She hesitated before pulling several folded papers from her purse. I wasn't supposed to see these. They were photocopies of handwritten statements. Each one came from a different relative. Every statement claimed that my parents had always treated the house as their own, and that I had promised them they could live there permanently. Several signatures looked genuine. Several did not. Rachel swallowed hard. "My mom wanted me to sign one too." "You didn't." She shook her head. "Because I remember you buying this house. I remember helping you paint the guest room." She looked down. I couldn't lie. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then I carefully folded the papers. "May I keep these?" "They're yours." As she walked away, I realized something important. Greed had finally pushed my parents beyond taking advantage of my kindness. Now they were manufacturing witnesses. When Jonathan saw the statements that evening, he didn't look surprised. Instead, he quietly placed them into the evidence folder. "Good," he said. I stared at him. "Good." He nodded once. Because fabricated stories have one fatal weakness. They fall apart the moment real evidence enters the courtroom. The weeks before trial were strangely peaceful. Not because the conflict had disappeared, because both sides believed they already knew how the story would end. My parents walked through the house with the confidence of people who thought victory had already been promised to them. My father spent an entire Saturday replacing light fixtures in the dining room. My mother ordered custom curtains embroidered with her initials. She laughed while holding fabric samples against the windows. "They'll look beautiful here for years." Years. Every time she spoke about the future, she spoke as though I had already disappeared from it. Relatives came and went almost daily. Some offered decorating advice. Others discussed holiday plans. One aunt joked about finally having enough guest rooms for the entire family reunion. No one asked what I wanted. I had become invisible inside the home my own paycheck had built. Oddly enough, I no longer found that painful. Watching them celebrate before the trial reminded me of children building castles too close to the tide. The waves hadn't arrived yet, but they always did. Jonathan and I met twice a week as the hearing approached. He was meticulous. Every exhibit received a numbered tab. Every photograph carried a date. Every bank record matched a payment. Every security video included a certified timestamp. Nothing was left to memory. Nothing depended on emotion. "This isn't about proving they were cruel," he reminded me. "It's about proving they were wrong." That distinction mattered. The law didn't punish people for believing something. It punished them when the facts contradicted their claims. A few days before the hearing, discovery documents finally arrived from my parents' attorney. Jonathan and I reviewed them page by page. Their case relied almost entirely on three arguments. First, they claimed they had invested substantial money into maintaining the property. Second, they claimed I had repeatedly promised the house would eventually become theirs. Third, They argued they had permanently changed their lives in reliance on those promises. Jonathan quietly placed the documents beside our own evidence. They've committed. What does that mean? It means they can't retreat now. As we continued reading, something unexpected caught my eye. Attached to one affidavit was a handwritten list of alleged home improvements. Kitchen renovation, new landscaping, roof repairs, garage expansion. I stared at the page. Several of those projects had never happened. The garage had never been expanded. The roof was still the original roof. The landscaping invoices had all been paid from my personal account. I looked at Jonathan. They're claiming work that doesn't even exist. He nodded. And that's exactly why we let people finish telling their stories before interrupting them. The following evening, I returned home to find my parents hosting another family dinner. The atmosphere felt almost festive. Wine glasses clinked together. Someone proposed a toast. My father stood at the head of the table. To new beginnings. Everyone applauded. Then he looked directly at me. I appreciate that Emily has finally accepted what's best for the family. Several relatives smiled sympathetically in my direction, as though I had gracefully surrendered after a long disagreement. I raised my glass. To family. The words tasted strangely hollow. Only Rachel noticed the sadness behind them. As dinner ended, she quietly walked beside me while everyone else remained in the dining room. They really think they're going to win. I know. Doesn't that scare you? I thought about the stacks of evidence locked safely inside Jonathan's office. The videos, the receipts, the property records, the forged witness statements, the false affidavits, the months of careful preparation. Then I smiled. Not anymore. The night before court, I slept better than I had in almost a year. No rehearsed speeches. No imaginary arguments. No desperate hope that my parents would suddenly admit the truth. That chapter of my life had already ended. When dawn arrived, I dressed in a simple navy suit, gathered nothing except my purse, and drove toward the courthouse. Jonathan was already waiting outside. He handed me a thin folder. Inside were only the documents we would need that morning. The rest, I asked. He glanced toward the courthouse entrance. They're already inside. I looked across the parking lot. My parents had just arrived with several relatives. They were laughing. My father adjusted his tie. My mother smiled confidently, as if she were attending a celebration instead of a legal hearing. For one brief moment, our eyes met across the courthouse steps. She gave me the same expression she had worn my entire life. Certain, dismissive, completely convinced I would fold one last time. I simply smiled back, because I finally understood something she never had. Confidence without truth is only borrowed time. Courtrooms are quieter than most people imagine. The loudest sounds aren't raised voices. They're the turning of paper, the scratching of pens, the silence that follows a lie. When Jonathan and I entered the courtroom, my parents were already seated with their attorney. Several relatives filled the benches behind them. Some smiled confidently when they saw me. Others refused to make eye contact. Rachel sat alone in the last row. She gave me a small nod. It was enough. My father leaned toward my mother and whispered something that made her laugh. Even then, they looked relaxed, as though they believed the hearing was simply another step before receiving what they already considered theirs. When the judge entered, the room immediately fell silent. Everyone stood. Then we sat. The proceedings began with my parents' attorney. He spoke confidently. His presentation sounded polished. He described years of sacrifice. He claimed Robert and Linda Carter had invested their savings into maintaining the property. He argued they had relied on repeated promises from their daughter that the home would eventually become theirs. He described them as elderly parents who had devoted themselves to preserving a family home while their successful daughter had suddenly changed her mind. As he spoke, I watched several people in the courtroom listening sympathetically. It was a convincing story. If you ignored the facts, then the witnesses began. My aunt testified first. She claimed she had heard me promise the house to my parents years earlier. Another relative repeated almost the exact same wording. Then another. Each story sounded strangely familiar, almost rehearsed. Jonathan never interrupted. He simply wrote notes. When cross-examination began, everything changed. He approached my aunt with a single sheet of paper. You testified that this conversation occurred during Thanksgiving 3 years ago. Yes. You are certain? Absolutely. Jonathan nodded. Could you explain how that was possible? She frowned. What do you mean? He held up a document. According to your passport records, You spent that entire Thanksgiving week on a cruise in the Caribbean. The courtroom became completely still. My aunt blinked several times. I may have remembered the date incorrectly. Jonathan smiled politely. No further questions. One by one, the remaining witnesses took the stand. One claimed to have watched my father pay for roof repairs. Jonathan introduced photographs showing the original roof still untouched. Another insisted my parents had financed major landscaping. Jonathan presented bank statements proving every payment had come directly from my personal account. Another described a garage expansion. Blueprints. Inspection records. County permits. None existed. Every confident statement collapsed beneath a single verified document. My parents stopped smiling. For the first time that morning, I saw uncertainty on my father's face. Then Jonathan stood. Your Honor, the defense would like to call Emily Carter. As I walked toward the witness stand, I felt surprisingly calm. Not because I wasn't nervous. Because I wasn't carrying opinions. Only truth. Jonathan guided me carefully through years of financial records. The purchase of the home. The mortgage. The insurance. The taxes. The renovations. Every payment. Every signature. Every transfer. One by one, each document established exactly one fact. The house had always belonged to me. Then came the moment Jonathan had saved for last. Ms. Carter, did you install security cameras at your residence? Yes. For what purpose? Package theft. Were those cameras operating during the period in question? They were. He looked toward the judge. The defense requests permission to introduce Exhibit 42. The courtroom lights dimmed. A video appeared on the courtroom monitor. My front porch. My father speaking to a cabinet delivery driver. The driver's voice was clear. Where would you like these installed, sir? Without hesitation, my father answered, I'm the owner. Bring everything inside. The video ended. Another began. A contractor asking who should approve landscaping changes. Again, my father answered, I'm the homeowner. Another recording. Another statement. Another assumption. Not once did he mention that the property belonged to me. Not once did he describe himself as a guest. Then Jonathan played one final recording. The conversation I had overheard outside the dining room window. My father's unmistakable voice filled the courtroom. She won't. Emily always folds. Silence. Complete silence. I looked toward my parents. Neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke. For months, they had believed those words proved they understood me better than anyone else. Instead, those same words revealed exactly how they had planned to exploit me. Jonathan calmly switched off the monitor and returned to counsel table. He said only one sentence. The defense rests. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, I realized the courtroom no longer felt divided between my parents and me. It felt divided between stories and evidence. And stories, no matter how confidently they are told, rarely survive when the evidence begins to speak. By the time closing arguments began, the courtroom felt different. It wasn't louder. It was heavier. The confidence my parents had carried into the building that morning had slowly disappeared with every document, every recording, every contradiction. Their attorney stood first. To his credit, he did what every good lawyer is trained to do. He focused on emotion. He spoke about aging parents, about family expectations, about misunderstandings that should never have reached a courtroom. He suggested that legal ownership did not always reflect moral obligation. He argued that my parents had genuinely believed they would spend the rest of their lives in the home. As he spoke, I noticed my mother dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. My father stared solemnly at the judge. Anyone walking into the courtroom at that moment might have mistaken them for victims. Jonathan never objected. He simply waited. When it was his turn, he carried only a single folder to the podium. He didn't begin with the security videos. He didn't begin with the forged statements. He began with one sentence. This case is not about whether parents deserve kindness. He paused. It is about whether kindness can be transformed into ownership. The courtroom became completely still. Jonathan walked slowly toward the evidence screen. Emily Carter bought this property. A copy of the deed appeared. Emily Carter financed this property. The mortgage documents followed. Emily Carter paid every tax. Another exhibit. Every insurance premium. Another. Every major repair. Another. Each statement was supported by a document. No dramatic gestures. No raised voice. Just facts. Then he turned toward my parents. The plaintiffs asked this court to believe that years of generosity somehow erased years of legally documented ownership. He allowed the silence to linger. But documents do not forget. He displayed side-by-side comparisons. My parents' sworn affidavits, bank statements proving otherwise, witness testimony, passport records, claims of renovations, county records showing they had never existed. Every contradiction appeared on the courtroom screen, one after another, like dominoes. Then Jonathan reached the final exhibit. The plaintiffs also asked this court to believe they acted in good faith. He pressed a button. The audio recording echoed through the room. My father's unmistakable voice. She won't. Emily always folds. Nobody moved. The judge removed his glasses and looked down at the transcript for several seconds. Jonathan spoke quietly. Those are not the words of people acting in good faith. They are the words of people depending on manipulation. Then he returned to counsel table. His closing argument had taken less than 20 minutes. It felt impossible to add anything else. The judge announced a brief recess before delivering his decision. Everyone slowly stood. My parents remained seated. For the first time since this began, they looked at each other instead of at me. Their attorney leaned close, speaking so quietly I couldn't hear a word. My mother's shoulders trembled. My father no longer looked confident. He looked tired. Jonathan and I waited silently in the hallway outside the courtroom. Neither of us discussed the evidence. There was nothing left to analyze. Finally, I asked the question that had stayed inside me for months. What if they apologize? Jonathan looked at me thoughtfully. They're apologizing to keep the house. Not because they understand what they did. His answer hurt. Mostly because I knew he was right. The courtroom doors reopened. Everyone returned to their seats. The judge entered carrying a written decision. No one spoke. No one shifted. Even the air felt still. The judge began by reviewing the evidence. He summarized the deed, the mortgage, the financial records, the testimony, the recordings. Then he addressed the most important issue. The court finds no credible evidence that the defendant transferred ownership, promised ownership, or intended to surrender ownership of the property. He paused. Instead of relief, I felt an unexpected calm, as though I had already accepted whatever came next. The judge continued. The plaintiff's claims are directly contradicted by documentary evidence, recorded statements, and multiple material inconsistencies in sworn testimony. My mother's hands slowly covered her face. My father stared straight ahead without blinking. The judge looked down once more at the final page resting before him. There remains one additional matter this court must address before entering its final order. Jonathan quietly folded his hands. He had expected this. I hadn't. The judge's expression hardened. What occurred in this courtroom extends beyond a failed property claim. It raises serious concerns regarding knowingly false testimony and fabricated evidence submitted under oath. The silence that followed was unlike any silence I had ever heard, because everyone in the room suddenly understood the case was no longer only about who owned the house. It had become about the price of trying to steal it. No one celebrated when the judge finished speaking. Not Jonathan. Not me. Not even the court clerk. Justice has a way of arriving quietly. It doesn't need applause. The judge adjusted the papers before him and looked directly at my parents. Based on the evidence presented, this court finds that the property located at the address in question is, and has always been, the sole legal property of Emily Carter. The words settled over the courtroom like a final door closing. There exists no enforceable agreement transferring ownership. No equitable ownership interest has been established. The plaintiff's petition is denied in its entirety. I didn't move. I had imagined this moment so many times over the previous months. I thought I would cry, or laugh, or finally breathe. Instead, I simply listened. Because the judge wasn't finished. He turned another page. Furthermore, the court finds multiple instances in which sworn testimony was materially inconsistent with documentary evidence presented during these proceedings. My father's attorney slowly lowered his head. The judge continued. Several submitted affidavits contain factual assertions that have been conclusively disproven. His voice remained calm, professional, measured. The court is referring the record of these proceedings to the appropriate authorities for review regarding potential perjury and the submission of false evidence. A quiet gasp echoed from somewhere behind me. I didn't turn around. I already knew who had reacted. Several relatives had signed statements they never expected anyone to question. Now every signature carried consequences. My mother suddenly stood. "Your Honor." Her attorney gently touched her arm. She sat back down without finishing the sentence. For the first time in my life, my mother had no explanation that could change reality. The judge issued one final order. The plaintiffs shall vacate the property within 30 days. He paused briefly. They shall also reimburse the defendant for court costs and reasonable attorney's fees as determined by subsequent motion. The gavel struck. Judgment for the defendant. Just like that, it was over. Months of manipulation. Years of control. A lifetime of believing I existed only to solve other people's problems. Reduced to one written judgment. People slowly began standing. Conversations returned in quiet whispers. My father remained seated. His shoulders looked smaller than I had ever seen them. My mother stared at the table without blinking. Neither of them looked at me. Jonathan gathered our files with the same calm precision he had shown throughout the case. He closed the final folder. "Congratulations." I looked at him. "It doesn't feel the way I expected." He nodded knowingly. Winning usually doesn't. It just means the fighting is finished. Outside the courtroom, sunlight flooded the courthouse steps. Reporters weren't waiting. There were no cameras. No dramatic speeches. Real victories rarely look like scenes from television. Rachel caught up with me before I reached the parking lot. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "You don't have anything to apologize for. They're still my family." "I know." She looked back toward the courthouse entrance. "So are you." Those 4 words stayed with me longer than the verdict itself. A few minutes later, my parents finally emerged. They walked slowly toward their car. For a brief second, my father stopped beside me. His face looked older. Not because of the trial. Because certainty had disappeared. "We never thought you'd do this." His voice carried no anger. Only disbelief. I met his eyes. "I know." He waited for something else. An apology. An invitation to fix everything. Permission to pretend none of this had happened. Instead, I said the only truthful thing left. "You taught me my whole life that actions have consequences. I finally believed you." He opened his mouth but couldn't answer. My mother never looked in my direction. She climbed into the passenger seat without saying a word. I watched their car disappear from the courthouse parking lot. For years, I believed freedom meant convincing my parents to respect me. I had been wrong. Freedom began the moment I stopped asking them for permission to exist. Jonathan stood beside me with one hand resting on the closed evidence box. "You ready to go home?" I smiled. For months, that word had carried uncertainty, conflict, fear. Now it meant something completely different. "Yes," I answered. "This time, I'm going to my home." Winning a lawsuit does not immediately give you your life back. It simply gives you the right to begin rebuilding it. The court had ordered my parents to leave within 30 days. For most people, that would have been the end of the story. For my parents, it became one last opportunity to avoid accepting reality. The first week passed quietly, almost too quietly. They continued living in the house as though nothing had changed. Boxes never appeared. Furniture stayed exactly where it had always been. When I returned from work each evening, my mother still prepared dinner. My father still watched television in the living room. If someone had walked through the front door, they never would have guessed a judge had ordered them to leave. Jonathan warned me this might happen. People who lose control rarely surrender it all at once. They delay. They negotiate. They hope you'll change your mind. He instructed me not to argue, not to threaten, not to negotiate outside the written court order. The judgment already speaks for you. So I waited. Day after day, every conversation became strangely polite. My mother asked whether I wanted coffee. I declined. My father commented on the weather. I answered politely. Neither of them mentioned the judgment. Neither did I. Silence had become more powerful than confrontation. 2 weeks after the hearing, my father finally approached me in the kitchen. He stood there for several seconds before speaking. "We've been thinking." I looked up from my coffee. "We don't want strangers knowing about this." "Neither did I. If you let us stay." He hesitated. "We can put everything behind us." For a moment, I almost recognized the familiar pattern. Minimize. Redirect. Pretend nothing happened. The strategy that had worked my entire childhood. Only now, it sounded strangely small. "I can't do that." His jaw tightened. "We're family." I nodded. "That's why this hurts so much." He had no answer. Later that evening, my mother knocked softly on my bedroom door. She was holding an old photo album. "I found these." She placed it on my bed. Pictures from birthday parties, school plays, family vacations, smiling faces, happy memories. She slowly turned the pages. We weren't always like this. She was right. There had been good moments. Real ones. For a brief second, I allowed myself to remember them. Then another memory surfaced. Working overtime to pay their bills. Being told my dreams could wait. Watching every sacrifice become another expectation. The good memories had been real. So had everything else. I'll always be grateful for the years when you loved me well, I said quietly. But gratitude doesn't erase what happened. Tears filled her eyes. She closed the album without another word. The deadline arrived on a cool Friday morning. At 9 o'clock, Jonathan met me outside the house. A court-authorized enforcement officer arrived a few minutes later. No drama. No flashing lights. Just paperwork. Professionalism. The officer knocked on the front door. My father answered. He looked exhausted. The confidence that had once filled every room had completely disappeared. You've been given lawful notice, the officer said respectfully. Today is the final day. My father looked past him toward me. I saw anger, regret, pride, and something I had waited years to see. Acceptance. Without raising his voice, he nodded. We're leaving. The rest of the morning unfolded in near silence. Boxes finally appeared. Furniture was loaded into a moving truck. Relatives who had once celebrated their imagined victory never came to help. No one offered speeches. No one argued that the house belonged to them anymore. By early afternoon, the last truck door closed. My mother walked slowly toward me carrying a single key. She placed it in my hand. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, she whispered, I hope someday you can forgive us. I looked down at the key resting in my palm. Forgiveness. For so many years, I believed forgiveness meant pretending the pain had never happened. Now I understood something different. Forgiveness wasn't permission. It wasn't reconciliation. And it certainly wasn't surrender. It may happen someday, I said gently. But it won't change what I have to protect. She nodded. This time, she didn't argue. She simply turned away and climbed into the passenger seat beside my father. I stood in the driveway as the moving truck disappeared around the corner. For the first time since buying the house, there were no voices telling me who I should become. No footsteps claiming rooms that weren't theirs. No expectations waiting behind the front door. Only quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't feel empty. The kind that finally feels like peace. 6 months after my parents drove away, the house finally sounded like it belonged to me. Not because it was silent, because every sound inside it was my own. The creak of the wooden staircase in the morning. The coffee maker humming before sunrise. Music drifting through open windows on Saturday afternoons. For years, I had believed a home was defined by the people living inside it. Now I understood something different. A home is the one place where you no longer have to earn the right to exist. The legal paperwork continued for several weeks after the trial. Jonathan successfully recovered most of my attorney's fees through the court's final cost order. The referral regarding false testimony remained in the hands of the proper authorities. I never asked how it ended. For the first time in my life, I wasn't responsible for managing the consequences of someone else's decisions. That responsibility belonged to the people who had made them. Rachel visited often. Sometimes we talked for hours. Sometimes we simply sat on the back porch drinking coffee. One afternoon, she asked the question everyone else seemed afraid to ask. Do you miss them? I looked across the yard where spring flowers had finally begun to bloom. I missed the parents I kept hoping they would become. She nodded quietly. I don't miss the life I had with them. There was a difference. A painful one, but an important one. A few weeks later, an envelope arrived in the mail. The handwriting belonged to my mother. I recognized it immediately. For several minutes, I simply held the unopened letter. Months earlier, I would have opened it with trembling hands, desperate for approval. Now I waited until I was ready. Inside was a single handwritten page. No excuses, no demands, no requests for money, only an apology. She admitted they had confused love with control. She admitted they had expected sacrifice without gratitude. She admitted they had believed I would always choose peace over self-respect. At the very bottom, she had written one final sentence. I hope one day you remember that we loved you, even when we loved you badly. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back inside the envelope. I didn't know whether our relationship would ever heal. Some wounds require more than time. They require change. Real change. Whether that would ever happen was no longer my decision to make. Life slowly settled into ordinary routines. Work became enjoyable again. I accepted projects I had once turned down because I had been too busy solving family crises. I hosted dinners for friends who laughed without making anyone feel small. I planted a maple tree in the front yard. Jonathan joked that it would probably outlive both of us. I hope so, I told him. Someone should remember what finally grew here. On quiet evenings, I sometimes walked through every room before going to bed. Not to check whether someone had rearranged my furniture. Not to make sure another argument wasn't waiting around the corner. Simply because I enjoyed being home. One evening, I paused beside the front door. The same doorway where movers had once carried away my belongings. The same porch where my father had confidently told delivery drivers he was the owner. The same entrance where I had doubted myself more times than I could count. I slipped my key into the lock, turned it, opened the door, stepped inside. No fear followed me, only peace. People often assume my story is about winning a lawsuit. It isn't. The courtroom was never the real battle. The real battle was learning that love without respect eventually becomes another form of control. The verdict didn't give me courage. It revealed the courage I had been building every time I quietly chose truth over guilt. Every document I saved. Every boundary I kept. Every time I refused to surrender what I had honestly earned. Those choices built something much stronger than a legal case. They built a life that finally belonged to me. Sometimes justice arrives wearing a judge's robe. Sometimes it arrives the moment you stop apologizing for protecting yourself. As I turned off the lights and looked around the home I had worked so hard to build, I realized something my parents had never understood. They thought the greatest thing they could take from me was a house. They were wrong. The greatest thing I ever owned was the certainty that my worth had never depended on their permission. And once I found that, no one could ever take it away again.